Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich begrüße Sie zum letzten Vortrag in diesem akademischen Jahr. Und weil es der letzte Vortrag ist, haben wir nicht ein, sondern zwei Referenten. Das ist auch der Grund für die Doppelpultgestaltung. Actually, until lunch we thought that we would have only one speaker, namely Michael Lambek, because Michael Jennions had fallen ill, but he recovered heroically, and here they are, both of them. I'll start with Michael Jennions, born in Manchester, educated in South Africa and in Oxford, PhD in Oxford. Then he lived in Panama for some years before moving to Australia in 2002. Since 2009, he is professor for evolution, ecology, and genetics at the Australian National University. Main interests: reproduction and sexual selection, both from the female and the male side. He has been working on frogs, crabs, cichlid fishes, flies, and finches. And this is not very frequent for a biologist to work on such a variety of species. Most biologists are more monogamous in their disciplinary choices. He also has a strong interest in meta-analysis. To explain this to the humanists is how scientists go about in doing science. And again, the spectrum of the phenomena he takes into consideration is broad. It includes, for instance, the study of paranormal phenomena. Now, he doesn't study paranormal phenomena. He looks at people who study paranormal phenomena. It's not the same. And this is a particularly interesting test case, especially if one agrees with Michael that this is a scientific study of something, as he says, that does not exist. If there is no empirical grounding, then how do we establish whether, for instance, an experiment is correct or not? And where do we trace the border between what is scientific and what is not? And this is the question Michael is interested in. Other Michael, born in Canada, PhD Michigan in 1978. He is a cultural anthropologist, teaches at the University of Toronto since 1978, full professor since 1990, so extremely well radicated. He has concentrated his research, as anthropologists do, on one single species, but on different cultures. He has been working on people from Mayotte, people in Madagascar and in Switzerland. In Mayotte, he was for the first time 1975-76, if that's right. And this was for his PhD, and he has been returning to Mayotte ever since. Now, within human culture, I would say there is almost no phenomenon Michael would not be interested in. All forms of social and cultural behavior, systems of belief, of knowledge, and of norms. And he's also interested in what anthropologists actually do when they are in the field and study their fellow humans, which is something like the equivalent to what the other Michael calls meta-analysis. Now, the phenomena of human culture that one Michael investigates, these phenomena the other Michael would probably subsume under the concept of plasticity of the human phenotype. Both of them are interested in behavior, but the questions they ask are quite different. Michael Jennions asks, as biologists do, how questions and why questions, producing descriptions and explanations. Michael Lambek, on the contrary, aims for understanding behavior, and what understanding actually is, this is sometimes something scientists have a hard time in understanding. On top of this, what Michael Lambek produces are interpretations. This is the result of understanding. And this is something quite different from descriptions and explanations. And on top of this, understanding others can very often lead to a different understanding of oneself, and thus to an open process that is unlikely ever to end. Between the biologist and the anthropologist, there opens a wide space for interesting conversations with rich possibilities of understanding and of misunderstanding each other. Now, the Wissenschaftskolleg is one of the few places where such conversations can actually take place and do actually take place almost inevitably. And after some years of experience, I can say that such conversations tend to be both fruitful and undramatic when they concern specific concrete problems. Then humanists and scientists have actually no problems in communicating with each other. The conversation becomes more dramatic and less fruitful when you ask both biologists and humanists to reflect on the divide between them. It looks as though such reflection tended to increase the divide and make it appear larger and more profound than it is in normal everyday communication. Nevertheless, from time to time it might be useful to engage in such a reflection, and I'm both grateful to most Michaels for participating in this. My suggestion, by the way, had simply been to tell us what they had found out, if anything, about each other spending 1 year at the Kolleg. But they agreed to do something quite different, focusing on a marginal question of small concern, on life and death. And with such a subject, I have the suspicion that they might both be about to intrude into the sphere of yet another discipline, which is theology, but this we shall see. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luca, for that very interesting introduction. I have the feeling you should be the one giving the talk about the two fields. But I want to begin on behalf of Jackie and myself for thanking the VICO for providing us with such a wonderful 10 months. And the only thing we hold against the VICO is that they're kicking us out soon. We're deeply appreciative for all the care the staff has shown us and the collegiality of the permanent and visiting fellows. And this has been a year of rich intellectual stimulation and a lot of fun for both of us. And I particularly, of course, want to thank my dear friend Michael Jennions for putting up with me and for his incredibly open-minded engagement and interest in the work of all the fellows in all the disciplines. And he's really, I think, been the person here who has been most inquisitive in trying to understand what each of us do. When he speaks, you will get a lot of humor as well, but you're going to have to wait at least 30 minutes for that. So this year has provided the possibility for conversations between biologists and social scientists, and our pairing tonight recognizes that fact. Within their respective fields, natural scientists and humanistic social scientists have each developed distinctive epistemological approaches and different ideas as to what constitutes evidence, a valuable argument, and a reasonable conclusion. We could have emphasized our differences and tried to compete or argue with each other, but we think it more productive to complement each other. We take what could be considered the most general and unifying subject between us, namely life, and try each to say something interesting about it. Life is generally opposed or contrasted with death, and it is this common and indeed commonsensical opposition that I'm going to address. I'm doing so not to challenge or defeat it outright, so much as to nuance, complicate, or mediate it. Human beings comprise a natural species, commensurable with other species. And yet at the same time, humans have certain features that make us radically distinctive. One thing that all complex life forms share is that individual members of a species are born and they die. Species evolve slowly, but individual members are finite and rapidly replaced. That is a natural phenomenon. One thing that distinguishes humans from at least most other species is that humans recognize and try to make some sense of life and of mortality. We do so by means of what anthropologists call culture, what you could think of as signs, meanings, traditions, language, ritual, and so forth, that mediate our existence and experience. Hence, my approach to the nature of life and death is by means of culture, and what philosophers might call not human nature, but the human condition. Philosophy, says Stanley Cavell, does not seek to tell us anything new, but rather to understand what human beings cannot, on the whole, simply not already know. Whether or in what sense death is something that we human beings cannot not already know is itself an interesting question. Most people do know something about death from the personal experience of butchering animals, losing friends and family, or witnessing death in road accidents, war, or on film. But that is different from knowing one's own death or knowing death for oneself. Some philosophers have made much of the fact that we anticipate our own death. Death is a certainty of life, irreversible and incontrovertible. It's the fate of all living creatures and the other to being, as Hamlet phrased it. But humans also know that death itself is quite literally unknowable. Being dead is an oxymoron, and there are no explorers to come back and tell us about it. Hence, our existential knowledge is constituted by both self-evident certainty and acknowledgement of our own ignorance. If knowledge about what death is like is radically uncertain, no society appears to have resisted the temptation to imagine something about it and to put in place some set of practices to deal with it. Hence, another kind of knowledge about death, distinct from the purely existential, is what has been collected in the ethnographic record in the form of mortuary practices, professions of an afterlife, and so on. It's arguable whether or in what sense these public and collective responses to death override existential knowledge, but they shape practical understanding, and they themselves become objects of knowledge for anthropologists, philosophers, and laypersons alike. It is these ideas and practices concerning death that anthropologists come to know and study, not death itself. And since they are variable, ethnography, in contrast to philosophy, also contains much that, on the surface, we could not have already known. That is part of the point of it. No distinction appears more obvious than that between life and death, and yet on closer inspection, it's not so obvious. Medical scientists now argue about the criteria and the boundary of life and death. The anthropologist Margaret Locke showed in her book comparing transplant surgery in Canada and Japan just how difficult these debates are. Today, it's possible to receive vital organs from other bodies. To do this ethically, the source body must be dead. Yet to do it successfully, the vital organ must be alive. Organ transplants generate puzzles. Whose heart is this? Whose life is it? Do death and life come in parts or in whole? Are they criteria of the organ, the organism, the life form, or the biosphere? Or to go in the other direction of the cell or the gene? Language is also critical for how we think about these matters. For example, whether we speak of donating or harvesting body parts, or the very term transplanting itself. Once we no longer think about life and death as exclusive properties of the individual organism, we might speak of animation, inanimation, and reanimation. At least that is the conceit or the thought experiment of mine this evening. The anthropologist Janet Karsten, for example, writes of the suspended animation of the body on the operating table, but also in packets of donated blood. So does life circulate or flow, or is it better understood as terminated and reignited? As life is extinguished in the individual body, or perhaps released from it, what happens to it? Does it circulate to other bodies, fully or partially? And does it do so naturally, or as the result of deliberate human action, technically or performatively, directly or indirectly? What is the nature of the connection between old and new bodies or persons who are said to share the same life force or substance? What is the relation between the generations, between the animate and the no longer animate? Is there an analogy or even a direct connection, a further part of the cycle, between the life transmitted from parents to offspring in acts of conception, pregnancy, birth, or nourishment, and what is transmitted from the dead to the living, or the living to the dead, as in ancestral blessing or the careful disposal of corpses? I hope you see that what I'm doing here is raising fundamental questions concerning human kinship, human relations with and connections to one another, as human societies have understood them. These are questions central to philosophical and religious understandings of existence as well. I'm going to show this with the case of sacrifice. The literature and ethnography of sacrifice speak directly to the question of animation and deanimation. For if life is released at death to be channeled elsewhere, perhaps this happens best when the death is controlled and deliberate, as was the case for the Dinka spearmasters of South Sudan, who voluntarily had themselves buried alive in old age, or for Hindus who go to Benares to die, Jains who fast to death, or the many instances of regicide in sacred kingship. Consider as well Christ's sacrifice, or more controversially, suicide bombers who, like soldiers, give their life for their country or cause. Comparing practices across time and space, let's say provisionally that there are two kinds, that is, two Weberian ideal types of sacrifice. In the one kind, you kill in order to give and receive, definitively giving up one precious thing in order to possibly receive another, a death for a life. Here, the death and the life are discrete from one another, separated by time and the return of the gift. This kind of sacrifice can also be interpreted as destroying something in order to show your readiness, commitment, deference, devotion, determination, obeisance, willpower or will to power, your craziness. So did Abraham or Ibrahim offer his son. So did Jesus climb Golgotha. So have Christians devoted themselves in return, even though Jesus was quickly resurrected, restored from his suffering, point made. Deanimation followed by reanimation. There is a twist, of course. Christian reanimation is finally not with respect to life here on earth, but eternal life in the hereafter. Earthly life is simultaneously valued through Christ's sacrifice and devalued through his resurrection. Christians are promised they will be saved. They partake of Christ if they are Orthodox or Catholic, eat his flesh and drink his blood, and so ingest a piece of him. Literally, they insist, not metaphorically, materially enabling their own eventual resurrection. Or maybe if they are reformed and hence consume Christ only metaphorically, they're born again here on earth, reanimated by Jesus through his love. Or if they're charismatic, they're animated by the Holy Spirit. Now, in the second kind of sacrifice, identified by Malcolm Rule, but called by him specifically non-sacrificial ritual killing, the point is not the gesture or gift made to another. The aim is a more purely direct and material one of rechanneling life, of revitalizing a moribund world, a weary community, a sickly person, with the very stuff of life, captured in one body and transported to another. This is what James Fraser imputes to the sacrifice of the divine king, and what Edmund Leach attributes to the Christ story. In East Africa, the vehicle is often chime, extracted from the body of a ruminant, say an ox, and spat onto another, usually a human being. As Rule aptly puts it, the significance here lies not in the life of the ox, but the life in the ox. The Africans that Rule describes are naturalists, not supernaturalists. Life is taken from one being or state of being to apply it to another. Life circulates in this world. In this second kind of sacrifice, where the aim is the capture and rechanneling of life force, as in blood transfusion or transplant surgery, the death of the original vehicle is merely an unfortunate condition or accidental side effect. Whereas in the first kind of sacrifice, killing is precisely the point, the means, force, or principle itself. Sacrifice of the first kind entails the relinquishment, destruction, or spilling of something precious. But in the second kind of sacrifice, the death is merely an awkward necessity. If the effects could be produced without bloodshed, so much the better. And as Rule points out, very often death is produced without bloodshed, by means of suffocation. In life, breath circulates freely beyond the body and between bodies. In death, it is contained, stopped up. In life, blood circulates contained within the body. In death, it is spilled. So, blood and breath, sacrificial and non-sacrificial ritual killing. One kind of sacrifice is a personal intentional gift, the first move in a sequence of anticipated reciprocity, and another kind of ritual killing is a material redirection of life force. But perhaps they're not so different after all, merely local shifts of emphasis or interpretation of one and the same thing, respectively relatively personal and relatively impersonal circulations of life, based on the same premise, namely that death is necessary to renew life. Are these practices not also telling us that we cannot take life lightly, that at the root of all human value is life itself? If sacrifice in the first sense expends value, enjoys its willful dissipation or destruction, does it not also posit, even or especially in human sacrifice, that human life itself is the ultimate value? It is only on behalf of life of one kind that it is worth expending life of the same or another kind. If sacrifice is about the circulation of life, using deanimation as a means to reanimation, it asserts that there is no higher value than life itself. It is life against which other things may be valued, against which their value is relative. And does sacrifice not mark a definitive break with what has come before in order to build a new future? The death of the old, as the Dinka saw, is necessary for the birth of the new. Does it not bind the participants in a common commitment to what is newly brought into being? And is not what transpires, what is brought into being, a putting of the world or of one's relations in and to the world under a new or renewed description, making, or rather taking, or even staking a new beginning? And isn't that new description achieved through death one of established intention, direction, purpose, well-being, vitality, in short, one of life? Life here in its ethical, no less than its biological sense. If these performative intentions and effects shape the ethical force and message of sacrifice and assist our understanding of sacrifice as an ethical practice, let's not forget Rule's point that there is also a directly material, organic process and understanding. Are these practices then not also saying that without spirit there is no living matter? Spirit, as Rule puts it, and as many traditions do, is breath, is life. Equally, perhaps, are they saying that without acknowledging matter, and how better to acknowledge it than to solemnly destroy it, there is no spirit? So what I'm saying here is that we tend to think of life and death as negations of one another, in binary oppositions, absolute states and mutually exclusive. But everywhere they are not. Without life there could be no death. Without death there could be no life. Death and life are mutual conditions for one another. These are things that every society has known, things that, as Cavell put it, we cannot not already know. But perhaps this is also knowledge that every society has understood and elaborated and interpreted rather differently. And so now I'm going to take you for most of the rest of the talk to northwest Madagascar. There it is off the coast of Africa, and there's another map of it. Madagascar suffers from poverty that has grown over the years rather than receded. Many people suffer from undernutrition, malaria, infectious disease, and dangers of childbirth, conditions that adequate public health could resolve. And so many people die too young. At the same time, many live to ripe old age, being still largely relatively free from the twin conditions of modernity that my friends call the disease of salt and the disease of sugar. Malagasy addressed mortality with a story in which humans were offered the choice between two models of life and death, whether to die like the banana tree or the moon. In the image of the banana tree, the old are cut down so that new shoots can rise. Without death, there would be nothing new in the world. No variety, no life. By contrast, the moon provides an image of life without full death, but without reproduction either, a continuous and sterile cycling between half-death and half-life, a self-same singularity. In the story, of course, humans choose the banana tree, but in fact, the story also provides a commoner's perspective on Sakalava royalty. What distinguishes members of the royal clan is that they appear to have chosen the moon. They live on in half-life after death, or half-death after life, by rising intermittently as spirits, called Trumba, in the living, and conversely, they limit the number of their live offspring, contestants for their power. Ritual work is centered on reproducing ancestors, not descendants. Bound by taboos, limited in their offspring, and attending to their predecessors, members of the ruling clan are in some sense only half alive, but subsequently they are only half dead as well. Implicitly, there is a kind of sacrifice here, a sort of Faustian bargain. Alongside royalty are servants, referred to explicitly as ancestor people, who attend the death of royalty and guard their graves or relics in perpetuity, and hence they live a kind of half-life as well. In the old days, at least it's said, a youthful ancestor person was killed at the death of a sovereign. The victim provided the blood and vitality necessary at all momentous transitions, and that today is provided by cattle. Ancestors pile up, like so many authors in a library. And just as dead theorists are reanimated by junior scholars, so the ancestors are reanimated in a practice of spirit possession, in which half-deceased members of the royal clan and a few of their servants attach themselves to living persons, make demands on their daily bodily practices, and at times rise and speak through them. As the spirit animates the body of the medium, and as the medium's body materializes the spirit, it is sometimes made explicit that the spirit is arriving from under the burial shroud. So here you see a possession ceremony. There are many people already in trance as spirits, as members of the royal family, and there's somebody else arriving from under the shroud, what's like a burial shroud. A royal death is an incomplete death in which the deceased returns periodically in reanimated form. In their durability, lasting forever, their periodicity, coming into presence and leaving again, and their being not the full living person, the spirits who come to possess people and speak through them are likened to the moon. I think of the world in which people reappear after death as a sublunary world, a world under the sign of the moon, in reflected, indirect light. The moon is visible indirectly as a reflection of the sun. If darkness opposes light, or night opposes day, so the moon mediates these oppositions. As a light opposed to the darkness of the night, it is a secondary one, a kind of half-light. It is the negation of light. And so too are the spirits a negation of the negation of life. Circulating between their tombs and the bodies of their mediums, the spirits are a reflected, evanescent, sublunary form of life. This is the spirit who's just come out from the shroud. Sakalava say the moon dies monthly. Its monthly death and rebirth are evident to anyone who lives with minimal electricity. They assert that actions are more propitious if they are started when the moon is on the rise, not the wane. Ancestral ritual happens at night when the moon is full. Spirit mediums immerse themselves in the ocean at the beginning of each new moon. Mediums toss a small coin into the waves. They also keep a large silver coin at home on their altar table in a white dish with water and white clay. The water in which the silver rests is used to bless and purify people. The coin is linked to the person of the spirit. It's purchased when the medium first becomes actively possessed by the given spirit. Indeed, the body of whom the spirit is the animated half-life lies in a grave that contains a similar silver coin, having been placed at burial in the mouth of the corpse or in a white plate adjacent to the head. All members of the royal clan are buried with such a coin, even those whose burial practices otherwise accord with Islam or Christianity. And when the spirit rises for the first time in a new medium, the lips are wiped with such a coin, or the coin is spat out from the mouth, as though the corpse were rising from the grave. This ensures that the spirit can speak, and can speak clearly and truthfully. Here you can see the silver coin in the woman's mouth. I should say in the spirit's mouth. The coins were once currency, withdrawn from the market as material signs of royal power. The words for speech and for money, or precious metal, are homonyms, vola, and they are explicitly associated. Like silver coins, the words of the spirit should be real, solid, and truthful, not counterfeit. The word for month and moon, fanzava, was formerly also used for money, and at times moon and month are also called vula. Like the moon at its height, silver coins are round and shiny. Like the moon, they cycle, appear, and disappear, but ultimately remain singular and unexchangeable, the standard of value. In sum, there is a thick chain of associations between the moon and the monthly cycle on one hand, and precious coins and metals, royalty, immutability, death, authoritative speech, truth and value on the other. It's not just any coin that is placed in the mouth of the corpse or emerges from the mouth of the spirit medium. Is that for me? Sorry, I learned that trick from another lecture. I heard somebody do that. It's not just any coin that's placed in the mouth of the corpse or emerges from the mouth of the spirit medium. Not just any coin that rests in the dish in the tomb or the dish on the medium's altar. The coin must be made with a significant proportion of silver, and it must be of a kind known as a tsanganulu. The tsanganulu are French coins, but ones that precisely do not contain simply a head on their face, but rather three full standing persons. Tsanganulu means standing or raised persons, and here it signifies the rising of dead royalty as spirits. The vertically erect figures symbolize the interconnection of raising, renewal, force, growth, and the potentiality for action, in a word, for life. Now, while the standing figures originally represented, as you can see here, liberty, equality, and fraternity, replacing the heads of individual French monarchs decapitated in the Revolution, among Sakalava they have come on the contrary to stand up for the power of royalty. This inversion is a kind of historical irony. The coins are a fetish of hierarchy and the wealth and power produced through the former trade in living people, who might also have served as sacrificial victims. However, that significance is today far from understanding. Today, the coins are kept in the dishes of the mediums as stores of sacred power through which speech, potency, and purification are conferred. Certain mediums and monarchs also wear a tsanganulu on a chain around their neck, with the figure on the head side of the coin always displayed outward on their chests, almost as though the figures were an equivalent to the vertical figure of Jesus on the cross. The crucifix, too, is a potent, vertical, and visible sign of the power of death for life, and the chest on which it rests is the source of respiration, the seat of the soul. Although spirits are not continuously in overt possession of their mediums, they are a permanent presence in their lives. Mediums are thereby rendered more powerful, but also more vulnerable to the anger of the spirit. Such anger is most often produced by inadvertently evoking the death of the historical person the spirit was. While living with, and sometimes as, the reanimated monarch, the medium must avoid everything that had to do with the monarch's original deanimation. Because Sakalava frequently attribute death to poisoning, so the medium must avoid foods the monarch ate on the last day of his or her life. In other words, mediums are vulnerable to the pollution of death, especially as they threaten somehow to pull the spirits in their half-life toward full death, to remind them that they are, in fact, dead. The division of the deceased monarch into inanimate but hard and enduring bodily remains and animate, mobile spirit is replicated in the division of labor between the tomb guardians and the spirit mediums. Each former monarch is assigned a guardian who lives at the settlement adjacent to the cemetery. A given ancestor can appear in many mediums, but will have only one guardian permanently assigned to his or her tomb. The guardian can deal with the polluting elements of death without harm. Upon the death of any medium of the particular ancestor that the guardian tends, the guardian receives the tsanganulu coin and the clothing of the spirit, rendered impure by the death of the medium. In the guardian's hands, these items are desanctified. Guardians can wear the old clothing of royalty, and they, but only they, can resell the coins on the market to be purchased and resanctified by a new medium. And of course, there's a shortage of these coins now that France has the euro and is no longer producing them. Not quite sure what that's going to bring. In this way, guardians are compensated for their work by the half-living ancestors, and coins thus circulate among mediums as spirits do, returning to the cemetery before re-emerging. The spirits are neither fully living nor fully dead, but they move between death and life, or rather half-death and half-life. They rise from their shrouds and tombs, dress, greet people, smoke, drink, listen, and speak, and then they take their leave and return to their tombs. Often they emerge into presence, showing the symptoms of their death, most dramatically in a prince who choked to death, and most poignantly and powerfully in a queen who appears in the throes of childbirth that caused her demise. As they emerge into presence, spirits are brilliant caricatures of the living person, caught forever in the circumstances of their dying, compelling, charismatic, fierce or comic, intense and powerful, but for all that, fleeting, sensitive, in need of deference and care. The mediums mind their taboos, purchase their clothing, suffer their anger, and defer in the strongest way possible, giving way to them periodically, lending their dead their living bodies. At the same time, they provide vivid evidence of the suffering and indeed the pathos of death. Okay, I was going to talk a little bit about Switzerland, but I'm going to skip part of that. In Europe, people place fresh flowers on graves and invoke the terms like Geist and Seele. But as science became the study of the material world, this entailed a divorce of matter from spirit. Spirit and soul were left to religion, philosophy, psychology, and the humanities, or became successively rematerialized as mind, memory, and brain. Before science, matter and spirit were not understood as opposed, and their connection is retained in traditions that survived alongside science, developing in parallel, but also in relation, imitation, and response to it. Today in North America, this is referred to as New Age, but the Swiss practitioners I spoke with strongly reject this epithet, pointing to the antiquity of their traditions. One of the traditions is alchemy, associated with Paracelsus, born in Switzerland in 1493. Paracelsus was very influential before chemistry and pharmacology became distinct sciences and emerged as dominant industries in Switzerland. And he has regained popularity in certain circles today. At the basis of alchemy, or what is called in German Spagyrik, as propounded in the name of Paracelsus, is the transposition of matter from one kind to another via the distillation to its essence or spirit. Paracelsus used this approach in medical treatment, but no doubt as a Christian monk he did not apply it to dead bodies. However, there is evidently an elective affinity, if not more, between ideas of alchemy and reincarnation. In alchemy, matter does not disappear permanently, it is only transformed. Similarly, distilled to its spiritual essence through death, the soul can rematerialize in new and different bodies. Such a model was reinforced in the past century through the influence of Indian philosophy and mysticism, most evidently in anthroposophy, which acknowledges reincarnation. So in Switzerland today, many people draw on a combination of ideas from alchemy, homeopathy, anthroposophy, and similar practices, which I see as all interrelated. They are somewhere between religion and medicine, and they form a kind of parascience, at once imitating and refusing to defer to the authority of established science. I'm not saying these ideas are characteristic of all Swiss people, or even the majority, but they are found there, and they're found together with scientific medicine, Schulmedizin, and Christianity in a kind of heteropraxy. That means many people practice elements from all three. The lesson, perhaps, is that no single system is sufficient to address consistently and completely existential questions and practical dilemmas of life and death. As anthropologists look around with the particular kind of gaze we have, we see everywhere signs of animations and afterlives. In China, the statues of gods are animated upon their installation in temples, and Mao remains undecayed in body in Tiananmen Square, iconized on the head side of all circulating paper money, and resident deeply and ambivalently in memory among his contemporaries and their offspring. If one mediation of life and death is to think of humans resurrected in some kind of space elsewhere, paradise, hell, a distant island, or a dim waiting room, another is to recognize the presence of the dead, or some part of them, still here among us. Thinking with the Malagasy material, I call this kind of afterlife sublunary. The sublunary is a half-life, visible by reflection like the moon, but here on Earth, under the moon, partially materialized. Sublunary creatures are multiple, and they're often incommensurable to one another, not strictly definable by means of binary criteria, assignable within taxa, or distributable along clearly intersecting semantic axes. They could include ghosts, ancestors, and souls, and could be manifest in relics, biographies, or photographs. And photographs, in fact, are reflected emanations of light in much the way I've described the moon. Sublunary creatures invite us to think about what Ian Hacking calls historical ontology of body and soul, or matter and spirit, and to rethink opposed states of life and death as connected processes of animation, deanimation, and reanimation. So, I want to be clear that what I've presented here is not what happens at death, but the ways in which some societies have imagined what happens. Whether we are pure naturalists or not, we have to dispose of the bodies of those who die, and we need the means to address the difference their presence, and now their absence, has meant for us. I've approached this tonight not from a psychological perspective on grief, angst, mourning, loss, or conversely, introjection, but to argue more abstractly that in the human condition, death and life are inextricably intertwined. I know humans die, and I strongly suspect, though I cannot know for certain, that for the individual organism or ego, death is nothingness, non-existence. But I also know that for human society, death is a part of life and can be harnessed to the ends of life. Thank you.
Feel free to talk among yourselves for a moment or two. It's going to be a long evening and it's hot, so I know you have limited human powers. So. Okay, so I'm going to save my sincere thanks for the end, except to thank Mike now for having set up a hard act to follow. After his nutritious meal, I will be offering light after-dinner sweets to put you into a sugary coma. This, by the way, is a death head moth with a skull on its thorax. I thought it was a nice image of life and death in one. So when I was asked to give this talk, I went through the full range of emotions: anxiety, fear, depression, terror, despair, denial. But finally, I settled on nausea before I knew that I would have a virus, and here is why. A well-read man, far wiser than I, once said, "For a biologist, any biologist, death is a necessary and absolutely unproblematic characteristic of life." So thank you, good night. But as I looked for photos of Luca to illustrate the slide, I found these two, both of which are godlike. But which Luca said this? Or to put it differently, why do we know that one of those photos was taken before the other? So maybe I could say something sensible about that, maybe. Then there is the problem that being at Vico disrupts your equilibrium. After 9 months here, I've really begun to question the aesthetic value of science, and to question how I present my work. It seems that much we scientists do is potentially disappointing, at the very least, to the creative mind. Our reductionism, our parsimony, our desire to generalize rather than to revel in the singular. So can I still convince myself, let alone you, that science is as beautiful as a work of art? I did learn one important thing from an artist, though. This is not what you think it is. It's actually a musical instrument. It's the main lesson I've learned this year, so I'll be providing a musical accompaniment to my talk tonight. Of course, an instrument needs tuning, and I don't want to be a one-note act, so to alter its pitch, I will occasionally increase the size of the resonance cavity, like so. Oh. Fortunately, I am prepared. That might make the talk slightly longer than you would like. So Michael posed a series of philosophical questions about life and death. Should I respond to these? Here is one response. You can read it. Now, I hasten to add that I only half agree. Feynman earned the right to dismiss philosophy. He was a genius, and I'm not. And in truth, I like many of the questions Michael posed, but I can't match him in that area. All I can do is present a few biological facts that might illuminate the answers. And finally, I've got to remind you that biology is a huge field. People studying humans feel they are in discrete research areas, whether it's topics or geographic regions. And biology has its equivalents. But no one expects, say, a legal scholar to explain Byzantine pottery. But somehow, people expect biologists to explain everything. You want to know whether you should eat fewer carbohydrates. You want to know how HIV works. You want me to tell you what the name of every species there is that you find. You want me to be knowledgeable about the fossil record and biochemistry. So I'm going to ask you to lower your expectations a lot. That said, I will be insanely ambitious. So here's my top 10 list. You don't need to read all this. First, I will try to link my talk to Michael's in an area where I know absolutely nothing. I will also end with a topic that I know next to nothing about, the origins of life. In between, I will talk about why we die, whether evolution requires death, and the difference between death due to external and internal factors. So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour. All I really want to do is provoke questions for the end and for drinks afterwards, and ask you to consider whether biological facts about death are as interesting or perhaps more interesting than human fantasies about an afterlife. So here are two short videos from Zimbabwe. All you need to know is that the chimp on the ground, Thomas, don't worry, has died many hours, possibly up to 2 days ago. Pippa and Viz move in. Draw your own conclusions as to what happens next. just going to close up now. So some of you might have felt a little strange watching that. It's hard not to feel that something is going on. I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that Pippa and Viz know that Thomas is in a strange state, a deep sleep or even dead. But what exactly is Pippa doing? Is this a type of mortuary practice? I don't know. I also don't know how to test this. And frankly, as a scientist, I'm interested in testing ideas. Ideas are worthless to me unless they can be tested in the crucible of life. I want to stick my finger into the flesh wound. Another Thomas, Jesus' disciple, had the right idea. Be skeptical. So I don't think I'd treat that as evidence that chimps recognize death and are disturbed by it. So maybe chimps don't have a sense of death. Perhaps they lack the ability to mourn. So does this make humans unique? I doubt it. Here is why. Homo neanderthalis, Neanderthal man. Since their first discovery in 1908, numerous remains of the species have been found at various sites, and these sites resemble graves. But this claim has been controversial, but the latest research is pretty clear. Bodies were buried and additional items, in this case animal bones, placed alongside the corpse. So humans are not unique in treating the dead with respect. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hang on, Neanderthals are humans. Why? I'm going to disagree. If we were dealing with any other pair of primates, there would be little doubt that they would be treated as two species based on their genetics and morphology. The truth, as I see it, is that we simply cannot conceive of a world in which another genuinely sentient creature exists. We can barely stifle our own racist tendencies to dehumanize others based on tiny differences in skin color or eyelid shape. Could we even begin to handle coexistence with another emotionally mature, self-aware species? And I'll leave that there for now. Let's go on to something easier. What is life? Is it information that is replicated like DNA or words, meaning that errors or mutations arise and evolution occurs due to differential survival? If so, then ideas are alive. Ideas reside in brains. Some ideas stick and get passed around a lot. Some ideas are really sticky, like a belief in the duality between body and spirit. Other ideas, such as godless materialism, my own personal favorite, are less sticky. Only some brains seem to be receptive to harboring them. So some people dislike this emphasis on information, so they focus on entropy, the tendency to decay. Life is organized and structured. It resists decay. Erwin Schrödinger, in his famous 1944 lectures entitled What is Life?, emphasized entropy. But tellingly, his resultant book had a footnote saying that if he were writing for physicists, he would have focused on free energy. And energy does seem to be integral to life. Living things have a metabolism. But this still leaves us in a bind. What matters more, information or metabolism? Must life have both, or will only one suffice? But ultimately, if you take an evolutionary approach, you seem to be having a technical problem here. So if you take an evolutionary approach, you simply note that life comes from non-life, so there's a continuum, and a perfect definition does not exist. I'm going to have to go out of this, I'm afraid. Clearly not the only one that's sick. This computer has problems too. All right. So as I said, what's really more interesting is to think about what questions you can come up with. So Nick Lane, a very talented British biochemist, made a great point. Life and living are not the same. A spore or a virus is a form of life. It contains information to make something that is structured, but it's not living. Living is the act of using energy to grow, maintain, and sustain yourself. But it's still an open question as to whether it matters where the energy comes from. So, for example, a virus is often treated by biologists as not being alive because it uses the energy of another living thing, as I know for the last 2 days, a living thing like me, to copy itself. But so what? Plants seem to be at the opposite extreme of independence. They use carbon dioxide and water and sunlight to sustain and power themselves. But even plants need other forms of life. They need bacteria housed in or near their roots to convert nitrogen gas into a form that they can use to make proteins. And then there are in-betweeners, like this embryo in the middle. Is it a form of life? In one sense, it's a bit like a virus. Without its maternal host, it's dead. But it also has metabolic processes going on. So are you a pro-lifer or not? What is it? Another question for later. Next, is death essential for evolution? Survival of the fittest. So 25 years ago, a friend, Paul Stewart, outlined an idea for a sci-fi novel that has stuck with me ever since. His idea was humans send complex robots out into space, and these robots move away from Earth. And if they find a planet or asteroid, they land on it, they mine it for metals, extract them, and make copies of themselves. And these robotic copies continue ever outward into the void. Errors in copying arise, and over time, new types of robots will arise on the outer edge of the robot range. So does this type of evolution require death? I'd say no. So here's a fun real-world example from my adopted homeland of Australia. Cane toads were introduced to the country in the 1930s near Brisbane on the right-hand side, and they've since spread westward like an army on the march. So what's fascinating to note is that as you head westward, you find that their leg length is longer than it is in the east. And actually, if you look at the leg length of toads as they arrive at the very western front, where all is not quiet, longer-legged toads get there first, which is all that graph shows. So in geographic terms, there's evolution, there's this spatial sorting of types. The explanation is quite prosaic. Longer-legged frogs jump further and move faster. So as you go west, the faster-moving ones are getting there. Brilliant. So no, evolution doesn't require death. Differential replication is enough. That alone can lead to a change in the relative frequency of different types. So in the robot and toad example, this was in space, but the same is true over time. So imagine if blue replicates faster than red, then the world becomes, at least for a time, a blue planet, even if no red or blue individuals die. But of course, death does arrive. Think back to our robots. Sooner or later, some mutants will appear that dismantle other robots and use their deliciously high concentration of metal to make copies of themselves. Great, now we've got our first predator. Other robots might miniaturize and hitch lifts. Some might eventually even find a way to insert their software into their hosts and make copies of themselves. So before you know it, you've got parasites. And on Earth, as we know, parasites are ubiquitous. So given replication, errors, and natural selection, death seems inevitable. Predatory killing machines will evolve. But parasites can also be pretty clever killers too. Here's one biological example, the parasite Toxoplasma, which has the amazing ability to alter the brain chemistry of its host, in this case, a rat. So Toxoplasma's life cycle involves moving from rodents to cats. Now, of course, some rats are eaten by cats, but if you're a parasite, why not improve the chances? So amazingly, these rats that are infected with Toxoplasma are sexually attracted to cat urine. Talk about taking the piss. You don't need to be a great biologist to know what happens next. So how are we doing for time? Probably terribly. Let's go faster. So we have external mortality. Predators, parasites, asteroids, and poor judgment eventually kill us. But what about internal sources of mortality? Why did Luca look older, and of course wiser, in his more recent photo. Why do we age? I'm going to show you some graphs. Time is on the x-axis. It goes from the age of first reproduction until 95% of organisms are dead. The y-axis is the rate of mortality or abundance. So red is the rate of mortality, and the shaded area is the proportion of individuals that are still alive in a cohort. So here we have humans in a long-lived population in Japan. They have a low rate of adult mortality for a long time until they hit about 80, and then suddenly your chances of dying really go shooting up as you get older. And correspondingly, of course, there's a drop-off in the population size. So by 102, almost everyone is dead. So this is senescence or aging, the decline in the ability to self-sustain with increased age. And here are graphs for a whole bunch of species. All I want you to do is look from the top left to the bottom right. And if you do so, you will see the red mortality curve becomes less steep and almost flat. So not every species senesces. So red deer and chimps, like humans, senesce. But hydra, on the right there, show no change in the risk of dying with age. A 1,400-year-old hydra is at no greater risk of dying than a 14-year-old hydra. Of course, there are fewer older hydra. Extrinsic mortality takes care of that, but otherwise there's no aging. And a 64-year-old tortoise has a lower risk of dying than a teenager. So there's hope for us yet, Mike. Now, I show you these graphs because the standard story is as follows. Due to extrinsic mortality, old individuals are rare relative to young ones. Vico is an aberration in this regard. So most selection acts on the young. So this means that nasty mutations that only affect older bodies will accumulate in the gene pool. We could, for example, all contain a gene that causes us to literally explode at 150. It will not be selected against if no humans make it to 150. Selection will be blind to this effect. Likewise, selection is weaker and almost oblivious to genes that only have bad effects in relatively rare older organisms. But logically, though, this implies that all species will senesce. And we just saw this is not true. So maybe things are a little bit more complicated. So what else could explain senescence? Another idea is a trade-off between a certain present and an uncertain future. Better to invest in increasing your fitness today, even if this costs you tomorrow. After all, one of these tomorrows, you're going to be dead. So here's an example from work I did with my colleague John Hunt. We artificially selected on lifespan in male crickets. In 4 selection lines, we only bred from long-lived males. In another 4 lines, we only bred from short-lived males. And what happened? Well, there seemed to be genes for lifespan because after 4 generations of artificial selection, we'd created 4 populations where everyone died sooner. This is the start of the population. Everyone's alive, 100%. And this is how long till everyone dies. And you can see the difference between the short-lived and the long-lived. Basically, they lived half as long. So why did this happen? Well, closer inspection shows that the short-lived population started chirping earlier. This is days since sexual maturity, and this is how much they chirp. So chirping is sexy, but apparently costly. It wears a male out, and then he dies. And this brings me to a final trade-off that leads to death and is ubiquitous in nature. Fitness is not fitness. Selection favors those who produce more offspring, not those who live forever. So sex, or more accurately reproduction, is mainly what life is about. And love will kill you. So one example comes from a frog I worked on years ago in Panama that has a great call like a video game. Dung, 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 dung. So I'm going to play the call of it, but when you listen to it, notice that it has both a whine and a chuck, which I can't impersonate. Now, females love the chuck. No, we have no sound. Okay, that's fine. I'll just impersonate it. Dungar, dungar, dungar. That's what it sounds like. You'll have to trust me on this. The problem, though, is that although females love the chuck, so do frog-eating bats, and that is often the result. So one little clue the males know the chuck is dangerous is that when a male is calling on his own, he whines, but he doesn't chuck. So chucking is reserved for competing with other males to attract females. So sexual selection can lead to the evolution of ornaments, be they physical, acoustic, or chemical, that make you sexy, but at the price of increasing your risk of dying. So does anyone avoid death? Well, think about simple single-celled organisms that reproduce by dividing. One cell becomes two. There's no continuity of the individual, so external mortality aside, no one dies. It's not quite true, but it's close enough for now. So basically, death is a product of being a eukaryote. That's the cell type that most of us are familiar with a nucleus. And these are the kind of cells that have sex. So in multicellular life, which is most of the organisms you are familiar with, there's usually a distinction between the soma, the body, and the germline, the cells that make eggs and sperm. And once you have this distinction, you have a problem: tissue specialization. The organism will only be designed by natural selection to last as long as its least renewable tissue. So this is the car manufacturer Henry Ford. He apocryphally told his managers to visit junkyards to find out which parts of the Model T Ford were still in working order. And then he told his engineers, we'll make these parts more cheaply. Each part need only last as long as the first one that will wear out. And our bodies seem to do the same. So the evidence that a soma germline distinction matters comes from organisms that lack this distinction. So in groups like sponges, that's a little boy holding a giant sponge, or plants or hydra, many cells remain totipotent. They're like stem cells that can make all tissue types. So recall this graph. So hydra, perhaps they don't senesce because they lack a germline soma distinction. In contrast, once you have specialized tissue, say a brain, but it's hard to replace, when it fails, the body dies. Brain dead, dead. But why do only some multicellular species have a germline soma distinction? The answer might be related to mitochondria, the hundreds, even thousands of little powerhouses in almost every cell in your body. Species with fewer specialized tissue types have fewer mitochondria. Trees have fewer than mammals. And more importantly, species with a germline have a high rate of mitochondrial mutation. So why all of this is the case is the subject of ongoing research, and time really doesn't permit me to elaborate on the implications. But this very recent paper is well worth reading, and it's really recent, so I haven't fully absorbed it myself, but I think it's fascinating. So mitochondria might also explain variation in aging. Think about a rat and a pigeon. Pretty similar body size, but a rat lives 3 to 4 years and a pigeon up to 30 years. Why? Now, Nick Lane has speculated that this is a product of the maximum energy requirements of a species. Birds fly, and this means they need cells that are super efficient at generating energy. Any cell that has a low threshold for killing itself, cell suicide or apoptosis, as it's technically called, which is enacted by mitochondria, is selected against. In contrast, excuse me. In contrast, a rat has a lower metabolic needs, so there can be a far higher threshold to trigger cell suicide. So in short, due to variation in the strength of selection for the suicide threshold during development, adult birds end up with higher quality mitochondria than do rats. And this matters because cell death in adults, which is ultimately what's going to kill all of you, arises when mitochondria are overwhelmed and unable to sustain energy production. So finally, and I'm not sure how we're doing for time. Okay, we're coming to the last couple of slides. Please bear with. And finally, life. Where did it come from? I can't go into the details. All I want to say is the following. We're talking again about Luca, the last universal common ancestor. The key factor to consider is that life on Earth, all life on Earth, uses a very specific method to store energy. It's not wind power, not wave power, not green energy. We all use chemical energy. Specifically, in every species on Earth, our electrons are passed from protein to protein in the cell wall or the mitochondrial wall, and in so doing, proteins are pushed out of the cell or mitochondria, and the gradient of proteins that ensues is then harnessed as they flow back in, and this cranks a molecular device that joins two chemicals together to make something called ATP. And ATP is used by all cells everywhere on Earth to drive biologically important reactions to make stuff. So ATP is the MasterCard of life, used and accepted everywhere. So given life evolved from non-life, we need to find a chemical environment in which this type of chemical reaction occurs naturally and could then have been harnessed by protocells to get the ball of life rolling. And the current best guess is hydrothermal vents. Not those dramatic ones you might have seen on TV, these black smokers, but these gentle alkaline ones. So I'm going to end with two names and one biological entity. The entity is again the mitochondria, and person number one is Lynn Margulis. In the Summer of Love of 1967, she hypothesized that mitochondria are the remains of a love fest, 1.6 to 1.2 million years ago, in which one bacteria slipped inside another. Now, the available evidence that since then proves that she is right, as much as anything in science has proven. And this symbiosis, this joining together of these two cell types, had major implications. And the second person is Nick Lane. He's championed the view that this union of two bacterial cells was essential for the evolution of complex life, and as I've discussed, that leads to death. In short, the physical constraints on complex life are not information. DNA is abundant. Newts have got more DNA than you've got. But the constraint is usable energy. And until this bacterial union, which was a truly freak event, life was constrained to be really simple, just bacterial. But the evolution of mitochondria allowed for the development of the eukaryotic cell, which is found in every organism which we think of as complex. So according to all the available evidence, this only happened once. So it's our creation story. But unlike a religious creation story, biologists do not claim to know all the details, but I think it's a beautiful story. The complexity inside each cell in you, the machinery of life in the minute specks of being that make up you and me and every non-bacterial creature on this planet are truly mind-boggling. If I were to give you the stats, you can't believe you're alive. And the struggle to work out what is happening is going to be infinitely more awe-inspiring than, with respect, even the most hallucinogenic of religious explanations. Not least because the final story will be, to the nearest approximation, true. And truth should always trump belief. And on that deliberately provocative note, I will shut up.